Good afternoon and welcome. Good of you to join us here. There'll be more making their way into our building shortly as we meet with social distancing, and people are connecting on our website. Now we are streaming to YouTube, Facebook, and our website. And for those who are online, the best way to interact is to go to our web page, and there you can ask questions, and the link should appear somewhere on your screen up there, rosebaypc.org/live if you want to get to the exact page. We have the privilege today of tackling this topic of race and racism. Now, it's our intention to have an respectful, honest, and open, and truthful, and constructive discussion, because that's the most useful thing to have. But in approaching this topic, we know that there's a risk. There's a risk that we could be misunderstood, or we could unintentionally offend people. And the intention is not for us to offend anyone, but it's a risk that we need to take to actually have the conversation so we can better tackle these topics. So it's risky, but it's important, and so we're having the conversation. Now, we intended to have a diverse panel on our Q&A slot today, but time and social distancing made it impossible. And we would have especially appreciated to have someone of Aboriginal descent here, but it just wasn't possible given the time and the constraints we had. So today you're going to have to do with a Scot and a South African-born Australian of Indian descent to tackle this topic. But it doesn't mean that we cannot tackle this topic. Now, the narrative around race is often very simplistic, and I'm hoping today that we would make it a little bit more complicated. For example, I grew up in apartheid South Africa, and I experienced racism there, though not as badly as people who were murdered and tortured and so on. And I came to hear the gospel in a church that largely turned a blind eye to racism, but that's the place where I heard about Christ. And so the relationship between the church and the gospel and race is often complicated. And so we need to embrace that complication and think about how we move forward. When moving to Australia, I also realized that we as Australians need to have this conversation. Just in the very first month of moving here, the person who was doing our relocation told me, I don't know why foreigners come and take our jobs. I had no idea. I had no intention to take a relocation job there, but fair enough to him for having that concern. Now, as a Christian, when we approach these topics, we approach it, and even if you're not a Christian, something would resonate with you, that we approach it from people that are flawed. So we don't approach this topic from, well, we are all fine, someone else is the problem. When Jesus came to earth and he taught us what God's law meant, he basically said that we are all murderers because we often hate each other. He said, if you look at someone lustfully, you're an adulterer. So when tackling this topic of race, we should think about what we can do individually, or society, and even as a church to tackle this topic. And I'm privileged today to have David with us, and he's going to come up now as I ask him some questions for him to introduce himself to us. Before he gets to this point here, since we have a camera here, David, tell us a little bit about yourself and what is Third Space and all of those things.
Okay. My name is David Robertson. I'm a Scottish Presbyterian minister, but I work now in Sydney. I work for City Bible Forum, setting up this new project called Third Space, which is really a place where people can discuss questions of faith and particularly Christianity, their doubts, their fears, their disbeliefs, and so on, in what we would regard as a safe environment.
And regarding your time in Australia during this period, what has been the most amusing thing you've observed?
The most amusing thing? Yeah. A South African Indian Presbyterian minister? No. That wasn't a racist comment, sorry. That's a dig at Presbyterians. I don't know. Some of the rather vain attempt to observe social distancing in Chatswood. That's probably about the funniest thing I've seen. Yeah, it just didn't work.
I'll let you go on with the talk,
Yeah.
and we look forward to hearing from you. And those are online. Remember to ask your questions.
Okay. Yeah, it is my privilege to be here, although thinking all week, I was thinking, why did I agree to do this? Because it's a very controversial topic. However, it's something that I do genuinely feel really, really deeply about. I was speaking at a school in Western Sydney, and this girl who was an immigrant from Africa, well, she'd lived in Australia most of her life, but she came up to me at the end, and I had been talking about a book that I'd written for teenagers called Ask. And one of the questions, there were questions that came from teenagers all over the world. And I think one of the most moving questions was from a teenager in Kenya who wrote and said, "Why is it that God made white people superior to us?" And the girl came up to me and she said, "Can you tell me the answer, please?" And I spoke to her and I told her that all human beings were made in God's image equally. And she just started crying. And she said, "I wish that's how I was treated." And I just thought, it's hard sometimes to understand what it's like to be discriminated against because of the color of your skin. I only had a little bit of it once when I was in Jackson, Mississippi, and I went to an African-American Baptist church, and there were 400 people there. Myself, my wife were the only white people. And suddenly I thought, oh, maybe this is how it feels. And I do think that human beings are essentially often tribalistic. I also think that racism is one of those terms that gets used a lot that people often don't understand what it is. And sometimes we use it about other people. Other people are racist, not us. And sometimes we have to look in a mirror. And I think here in Australia, one of the things that I like reading history, and I've been reading a lot of Australian history to try and understand. And I think one of the things that has chilled me a lot is I'm from Scotland, and I have here, I thought I'd wear these. These are my cufflinks that have the Scottish saltire on. And you'd say, oh, in Scotland we're not racist and we're proud of being Scottish. But the saltire was turned into the Confederate flag and the Ku Klux Klan. And when Scots came to Australia as well, there were some of us who treated the Indigenous people here like animals, because many people did believe that Indigenous people were not human. I read John Harris's One Blood, which I would highly recommend. I found it a deeply confronting and disturbing book in lots of ways. But he says this, amongst many, I have hundreds of quotes from that book. I just think it's a brilliant book. The book, it looks at how Christianity impacted Indigenous people for the past 200 years. And it's a very honest book. It shows the negative side and it shows the positive side. And he says this, among the missionaries were those who saw with bitter and painful clarity that their dispossession of Aboriginal people by members of a so-called Christian nation contradicted the gospel and prejudiced Aboriginal people against the religion of the whites. Now there were, the problem is, when I put in the question, is Christianity the cause or the cure for racism? You have to define what you mean by Christianity. And many of the people who came to Australia, including a boatload from my own city, Dundee, were, how shall we say it, criminals. They weren't necessarily coming here as missionaries. And it's interesting, the perspective that many people had of Christianity. So they believed that Christianity was a reflection of European, other words, white values. And they forgot who Jesus was and where he came from because he wasn't white. And they assumed that other people were somehow less, which is the very essence of racism. Now, I think if you understand Christianity in that way, then you've not understood Christianity. It's not Christianity, because Christianity teaches something profoundly different. And I thought I would there are several verses in the Bible I would mention, but this one, Acts 16, where Paul addresses the Greeks and in Athens, and he says this: "From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring." Now, what is fascinating about that is, if you're looking at a basis for equality between races, and by the way, I would regard the whole idea of race as itself unbiblical. I think there is one human race, and I do think the concept of races is, in effect, a human construct, even a social construct. But if you believe that all human beings are descended from Adam and Eve, as the Bible taught, then by definition we are all one human race. And that has profound implications, because in the image of God, says Genesis, we are made. Now that is a basis, whether you agree with that or not, that is a basis for equality. It is very difficult to see what the basis for equality is when you remove all of that. You may want it, you may like it, but what is the basis? And it's interesting, because I find I've been trying to read a fair amount of Chinese literature as well, although forgive me, I'm not able to speak Chinese. That's where I hope for the gift of tongues. And I've also been reading, as I said, a fair amount about Indigenous history here, and also some African things. And what I find really, really interesting is that it's my view that in general in history, you'll find, if you go back deep enough, if you go beyond Confucius in China, for example, or if you look at the indigenous history here, that people did believe that there was one creator. They weren't naturally polytheists. It seems as though that people were monotheists, then moved to become polytheists, and then as Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Islam came along, moved back to being monotheists again. But my understanding, from what I know of indigenous spirituality and the Chinese understanding as well, is that there was this view of being one creator, and that certainly is the biblical view. And from this one creator comes his whole creation, which includes all human beings. So how do we end up with racism? James chapter 1 verse 1 says this: "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you?" Well, take that as regards Australia. It was declared to be an empty land, so there was no need to do anything legal in terms of taking the land away from the indigenous people. And one of the reasons for simply doing that was this is a very rich country in lots of ways. Often you'll find that fights are about wanting to obtain things for ourselves. Now, I do want to say something at this point about slavery, because I was once speaking in a library in Brighton in England, and I was 2 minutes into my talk. I wasn't speaking about racism or anything like that, and this young man stood up and he said to me, "You're responsible for slavery." I probably shouldn't have done this, but I looked at him, thought it was so ridiculous, and I said to him, "No, I'm not. I sold my last slave a couple of years ago." And he just looked at me and went, "What?" And I said, "Come on, what do you mean I'm responsible for slavery?" "Oh, just by being white, you're responsible for slavery." I said, "Isn't that a bit racist? Just because of my skin color, you're judging me?" Now, my point, and I eventually got the opportunity to make it once he calmed down, is that slavery has always existed in human society. Always. It's very difficult to find any society that did not have slavery. What astounds me, by the way, is that in my time, slavery has returned to Western society. When I grew up, there was no slavery in Western society, but it's returned, as we'll see. For example, historically, over 1 million white Europeans were enslaved by Arab traders in the Middle Ages. Africans enslaved and sold one another. In the 17th and 18th century, I think the period which we're most familiar with in these terms, European slave traders took millions of Africans to the West Indies and America to staff their plantations. It was a shameful and disgusting trade, which sometimes the church, many in the church, acquiesced in. The universities acquiesced in. The states acquiesced in. It was ended only after campaigns led by such as the great Christian reformer William Wilberforce, at great cost to the British Empire. You need to remember that. It's hard to think of examples of people who gave up the slave trade. It cost the British Empire at that time some equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars. Missionaries like David Livingstone and Mary Slessor from my own country were instrumental in campaigning against slavery within Africa. But today, this is not an argument about the past. Today, slavery still exists. There are people in the United Kingdom, there are at least 20,000 sex slaves. In this city in Sydney, there are people who are slaves. And that is difficult for us to grasp. I think there are also other milder forms. This is probably a wee bit more controversial, so you can write in if you're online and have a go at me for quoting Marx or sounding like I'm quoting Marx. When rich countries like Australia can't get people to do what we consider to be demeaning or hard jobs, then we import people from poorer countries, pay them less and exploit them. What Marx would call wage slavery. But it has to be said that I think the people who suffer most from racism do tend to be those of African origin. In many different cultures, in China, in the West, and elsewhere. Racism is basically the belief that because of our skin color, we are superior. Now, I want to suggest this as well as a slightly more controversial thing. I think white racism today, or Western racism, is not so much tied in with skin color, but with a kind of social Darwinian view that the highest evolution of the human species is largely white, middle-class liberals. Charles Darwin argued in The Descent of Man that the Western nations contain the civilized races of man, and they will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races. The full title of Darwin's work on the origin of the species was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Those who accepted Darwinian evolution in effect believed that being a white European, you were at the top of the scale. And that has had incredibly harmful consequences. I find this almost impossible to believe, but it is true that in the 1920s in this country, parties of white Europeans came here to hunt Aboriginal people, Indigenous people. The number of massacres that are recorded, I think that they are significant, but I suspect that there were many that were not recorded. The 19th century writer H.G. Wells, famous for books like The Invisible Man and War of the Worlds, in his New Republic said this, and now he was a classic liberal, Western liberal, and he said this, as for... he talked about how the New Republic would deal with the inferior races. And he said this, such as the black and the yellow man. He said, well, as for them, the world is a world and not a charitable institution, and I take it they will have to go. So you understand that here is somebody, a classic 19th century European liberal, arguing ultimately the Indigenous Australians, Africans, Chinese, all will have to go because the whites are the top of the street. Now, it's incomprehensible for us to say, okay, you know, did people actually believe that? Yes, they did believe that. And they believed it because of their ideology. Now, today, of course, all liberal progressives would shout out loud their anti-racist credentials and how they believe that all humans are equal. But why? Why would you believe that? Professor John Haldane, Roman Catholic professor of philosophy from the University of St. Andrews, I heard him once give a lecture on equality in which he said, how are we equal? And I understood this exactly because I'm not equal to Usain Bolt in terms of speed. I don't have the same head of hair as the Presbyterian minister in this particular building. There are many things that I'm not equal to. How are human beings equal? The rational basis that Christianity has is that all human beings are created in the image of God, and that provides a real basis both for equality and for diversity. I find it fascinating that many white liberal progressives believe that their culture is superior and their values are better and should be accepted by the whole world. That's why you often get Western charities or government agencies giving aid to Africa, for example, with conditions attached. They want to impose their views on issues such as abortion on all the countries of the world. I remember once the Ghanaian president of Ghana came to the Scottish Parliament, and he was treated with contempt by some of the MPs who turned their backs on him because they were protesting against Ghana's laws on sexuality. And I wrote a piece defending him and saying that it was wrong for us to make that kind of judgment. And I got a letter from the Ghanaian ambassador saying, it was a very heartfelt letter saying, thank you very much. And he said, do you know that Ghana is probably the 7th largest, or is going to be the 7th largest economy in the world? We're trying to build our country along biblical lines. And he said, in Western countries, they treat us as backward. And I think that's true. I think that happens a lot. It's funny, I would say, as regards myself, that I probably grew up with that attitude a little bit. It's hard for me to think of the Chinese as backward, but you'd say, oh, well, the country's not as advanced. And sometimes you'll see people who come from my background who will go to South Korea or somewhere and go, wow, okay, they're so far ahead of us. And you see the different attitudes that people can have that come in. I wonder if one of the things that will have to happen in the church is for those of us who come from a background where the European church has been considered to be, as it was for a long time, the center of the Christian world, we'll have to come to recognize that in the 21st century, it will not be America, it will not be Europe, it will be Africa, and it will be Asia that will be the heart of Christianity. I hope Australia as well. I hope that here in Australia we will realize that we have a lot to learn from the Indigenous people here and not be patronizing. I think a lot of anti-racism stuff, by the way, is patronizing. I think there is a lot to learn from people of different cultures. Now, partly tied in with that is what I would call the biblical teaching or doctrine of salvation, Revelation 5:9-10. They sang a new song saying, worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain. And by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you've made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth. I once visited a man who was attending my church, who was actually a member in the church. And he came out with this astonishing phrase, and please forgive the language. I won't use the swear words, but he said, I hate Pakis. I said, I beg your pardon? He said, I work in a social security office and there's a lot of Pakistanis come in and so on. And he said, I just don't want anything to do with them. I said, I'm sorry, sir, but you can't be part of the church. He said, well, why not? I said, because you'd be really unhappy in heaven. Because it's going to be full of people who are different colors and backgrounds and everything. Jesus died for them all. And he looked at me and he said, are you being serious? I said, I'm being totally serious. I do not want you in this church until you recognize that that's a sin. You certainly cannot be a member in the church. You can come and hear about your sin if you want. And he was furious at me. He left. Wasn't great because we had a church of 7 people and take him away and his family, and there wasn't many of us left. But I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. There's something that I see in Christianity which is very, very different in that regard. I have a friend who is a very militant atheist, and his wife became a Christian. It's a bit annoying for him, really. Anyway, he came to see me one time and said, David, I hate everything you teach. I hate it. But I love what you've got. I said, what do you mean? He says, I come to your church, and he said, there's like 20 different nationalities here, and there's all different parts of society. And I think the church has got this wrong, by the way, when we've based churches on particular races or cultures. I go and sometimes speak at Scots Presbyterian. I'm really, really glad that it's not full of Scottish people, which it used to be. In fact, half the congregation are Chinese or Malaysian. And I think that's wonderful. Because the Christian church is not to be one ethnic group. And yet sometimes we have done that. And that's where when you're talking about South Africa, that was wrong when the church went along with that. And sometimes even encouraged it. It was just wrong. Biblically, it was wrong. It was theologically wrong. And I think there's another aspect here, a biblical doctrine of justice. Deuteronomy 16:20, follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land the Lord your God is giving you. Justice, people often talk about justice. You go on, if you were to go on a BLM march, people talk about justice. I want to say, well, what is justice? What do you mean by justice? And I actually don't think that our society has any concept of justice without Christianity. I speak quite a lot at a lawyers' fellowship, and I keep challenging them on this. Where do you get your law from? How do we understand what law is? What is justice? My argument would very simply be, if there is not a God of justice, then how can you have justice? Justice then just becomes a social construct in which the rich and powerful determine what justice is. So, if you were in Weimar Germany in the 1930s, the state could tell you that Jews were lesser human beings and could be killed and could be locked up. And if that's what the state said, where was the justice in it? And it's the same if you were in a country which approved racial segregation, or if you're in a country which justified some form of apartheid. And by the way, again, I'm so shocked in my lifetime. I grew up, when I went to university, campaigning against apartheid. And last week, I saw left-wing progressives in Seattle setting up an area which said, blacks only. Extraordinary. It's in South Africa we saw that. This is progressives saying that. It happened down in the University of Melbourne. I'm sorry, but any discrimination on the basis of skin color is wrong. People used to say to me, well, if your daughter came home with somebody from a different skin color, with an African, would you be upset with that? And I said, no, I'd be upset if they were English, but no, sorry, if you're English, that was an anti-racist joke. It was irony. But no, why would the skin color, the character, Martin Luther King's comment, we seem to have forgotten this today. Because he said, I don't want my children to be judged by the color of their skin, but by the quality of their character. And now we're reverting to this thing where, well, if you've got this skin color, you can get this job, or if you've got this skin color, then you've got a right to speak. But why are we judging people by skin color? It's just wrong. Follow justice and justice alone. And then lastly, I just want to say something about the church. And it comes really from Chronicles. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. I heard somebody say, I thought it was very interesting, when we had the bushfires. Remember them? Long time ago. Lots of things happened since then. But when they said about the bushfires, I heard them say, this was an Indigenous person, this is the judgment of God upon this land for the way it's treated the people. I thought that's very interesting. They were taken seriously. If somebody like me had said it's the judgment of God for the way that this country has turned away from the laws of God, people would have laughed and mocked me. But they didn't mock this lady. And although it was a bit of an extreme statement, I think there's an element of truth in this. When we go against what God tells us, then why should we be surprised if we reap the consequences? And I do genuinely, I don't think I can repent on behalf of generations that have gone But I do genuinely, as I read One Blood, I felt so ashamed that some of my ancestors probably participated in this brutal treatment of the Indigenous people. That doesn't mean that I look and I want to elevate one race as superior over another now, just in order to try and balance things. That doesn't mean that at all. It just means that I lament for the sinfulness within human hearts, and I long for true reconciliation. And I am thankful. I have to say this. I have been in churches where I have seen racism. I don't dispute that. But I am thankful that I've seen, particularly in churches, a level of unity between the races, which for me has been a wonderful apologetic for the gospel. I don't mean to offend any of the Presbyterians here, but my favorite group of Christians in Sydney at the moment are still the Chinese Presbyterians out in Burwood. And I love those young people. And when I was in London, it was the Afro-Caribbean churches that I found particularly warm and strengthening to me. But I just think, from a Christian perspective and from a human perspective, I care about people's cultures, absolutely, and the boundaries, as Scripture says. But I will never judge someone by the color of their skin. That to me is an absurd, illogical, and above all, unbiblical view. And I think Christianity is the cure for that, because Christianity is not absurd, it's sense, it's not illogical, it's very logical. And it unites us in the one person who can bring us unity, and that is Jesus Christ. So, that's where I'm going to end, and there's enough there, I'm sure, to cause some questions and comments. But, Glenn.
Thanks, David. We have a question here. Was BLM right to protest the way it did? Do you condone the toppling of statues, the breaking of pandemic restrictions?
Look, the toppling of statues is what Presbyterians did in the 16th century when we took over Catholic churches. So if you want to go there, maybe. I genuinely think it's such a daft thing to do in lots and lots of ways. It's such a trivial thing. I guess some people consider it symbolic, but when you have the statue of Abraham Lincoln being defaced, and this was the guy who fought the American Civil War to emancipate slaves, or right now they're talking about taking the statue of Lincoln down in Washington, which has a slave at his feet, and they do not realize, people are so historically ignorant, they don't realize that that particular slave, it was celebrating his emancipation, and apparently, I just saw a clip of his great-great-grandson, an elderly man, pleading with these young, usually white radicals, don't take this statue down. This was put up to celebrate the emancipation of slaves. So no, I think that BLM is wrong. My slogan about this is, and I did write about it, is I do believe that the phrase Black Lives Matter is important, and I don't think it should be countered with White Lives Matter too, or All Lives Matter, because what it was saying was that I think Black Lives Matter just simply means this, that black people should be treated as equal. They matter as much as everybody else. But the organization Black Lives Matter, I find, to be honest, quite ridiculous. And I find it to be a pseudo-Marxist organization with views about the family and everything else that will do a great deal of harm to people of all races. So for me right now, the current issue is very, very confused with many, many different viewpoints. I approach this with a specifically Christian viewpoint, and I find the organization, not the slogan, but the organization Black Lives Matter, to actually be quite harmful. And in my view, by the way, and I'm very sad about this, I think race relations are in danger of being put back 50 years because of what has been going on in the United States and in Europe and possibly also here.
Thanks. The other questions on the screen there. How does Christianity's answer to racism, and racial justice differ to those of other religions and ideologies?
Wow, okay. How long have you got? No, let me put it simply. I think in theory, Islam would be largely the same. I say in theory because in practice I don't think it is. And I think where you're most likely to get slavery nowadays is in Islamic nations. That's one problem. I think as regards Hinduism, the caste system is, for me, although socially it's not necessarily tied in with race, I think it becomes tied in with race. So I think that... And I think there are forms of Christianity which at times can be racist. I don't accept them as Christianity, but I think when you get far-right organizations talking about being Christian, I'm extremely wary of that. The reason I think that Christianity works is not just because of creation, all being made in the image of God, but also because of Christ, who died for people of every different race. And I think that's unique in that sense. I cannot... If I went as a missionary... I had a friend, I say friend, he's not a friend. A man called Eiley Burns in the 19th century, I'm not that old, who went to China, and together with Hudson Taylor, they were radical in Western European terms because they didn't stay in a white compound. They learnt Chinese, they learnt Mandarin and Cantonese and other Chinese dialects. And they did not teach Jesus as the white man. They taught him as the Son of God, Palestinian, so he wouldn't have been white anyway. And I think you'll find that Jesus appeals to all different groups and tribes. I mean, I remember my parents came back from South Africa once, and they had a kind of picturesque thing of the Lord's table, the Last Supper, and all of the people on it was from Africa were black. And I remember as a teenager thinking, is that right? And then I realized it wasn't right, but neither was the one that we had of everyone being white. That there probably actually would have been in between. They're basically Palestinian Jews. So I think that the big difference in this is some would share the doctrine of creation, but I think it's the doctrine of salvation with Christ dying for all people that's significant.
Thanks, David. And you're welcome to ask questions from those who are here as well. And while you're thinking of a question, I'll ask one that's on the screen. With globalization and mixed marriages, are we seeing a redefinition of race along the lines of social class?
Wow, okay. Wow, yeah. I think there's always been mixed marriages, although maybe more so now, but I'm not sure. What worries me, what's going on in the West, is now identitarian politics, where we're now identifying ourselves in terms of things like skin color. But it may be true that what divides people in reality more is social class. So that wouldn't matter what skin color you are, if you're part of the globalized community that jets from city to city, though not just now, then perhaps you have more in common with other, maybe a middle class white person in London has more in common with a middle-class Chinese person in Hong Kong or a middle-class African person in Nairobi. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But I think again, from the Christian perspective, we must not allow... I think class is actually probably more invidious than race. And I find it ironic that a lot of the people who claim to be anti-racist are very wealthy people. And I think the division between them and others is perhaps even more significant. But that's another issue, but thanks for raising it.
Are there any questions here? What do you think? There's another one there. Christianity seems to be exclusive, believes that every other religion goes to hell. Does that make it
Does that make Christianity racist? No. Well, no. Christianity is not racist in that sense, because we're not saying like white people go to hell, or you're because of your race you're going to heaven. I mean, I did used to think that heaven was populated entirely by Scottish people, but if you've been to Scotland, you realise that would not make it heaven. It would make it the other place. Look. Nobody goes to heaven because of their social background, their race, where they were born, or even how they behaved. It's whether we accept salvation from Jesus Christ, and Jesus said this gospel has to be preached to all people of every different background. So ironically, the question is implying one thing. I think what the Bible teaches is precisely the opposite. Christianity does not discriminate on the basis of race. The question was kind of mixed up because it was talking about other religions. Only if you accept religions are racial, and I don't. Maybe there's some that fit in with tribalism, so you have tribalistic religions. I do not accept that Christianity is a tribalistic religion. It doesn't bother me a huge amount, what I said earlier, that I do think the center of Christianity in the 21st century is most likely to be East Asia, and if not, it will be Africa or possibly both. It bothers me that my own people, if you like, back in Scotland have largely rejected Jesus Christ, but the church will prevail because God is at work in many, many other places. There are far more Presbyterians. Scotland was the home of Presbyterianism, by the way, unless you accept that Jerusalem and the First Council in Acts was, but in modern day Presbyterianism, Scotland was. There are far more Presbyterians in Ghana than in Scotland, far more in South Korea. I just think God will work amongst human beings, whatever the race. So I don't accept the premise of the question.
Maybe I'll ask one of my own questions here. The church is constantly reforming, dealing with our blind spots and sin and all of that. And obviously in race relations, we all could do better on whichever side we are. What are some strategies or ideas or broad approaches you think could work to help the church move in the right direction, continue moving in the right direction?
I think churches should largely reflect the communities which they are in. So I'm not surprised when I go to Chatswood Presbyterian Church that there are a lot of Chinese people who are there. I'm intrigued that in St. Thomas's we have a significant number of Indian or Sri Lankan or Malaysian people as well. And that's reflecting the community in which we are in. And I think that's a good thing. I think possibly a good biblical theology, and each of us could reflect upon how we sometimes judge other people, if not by their skin, at least by their culture. And I think we need to be careful of that. I think we need to be really careful about patronizing people. I had a friend when I was at university. He was a bit bold. He was from Nigeria but brought up in the United Kingdom. And he used to say things that as a white person I couldn't get away with. Like he would say to me, "Oh, pale face, look at you. Go out and get a decent suntan." You know, he would mock me, but we were really, really good friends. We got on very, very well. And I found one of the things he said to me was that he hated most being patronized by people. I just think we shouldn't judge people by the color of their skin. It's interesting the comment that you made about coming to take our jobs. You know, I've seen sometimes you see racism in a different form. So someone maybe who's got black skin standing at a door somewhere, I've seen people assume that they were the door porter and not the professor about to give the lecture. And that's just a judgment that's made on the basis of skin color, and it's entirely wrong. I've just learned in general in the church not to judge people by their appearance. I mean, this is not a racist thing particularly, but I was in a meeting once and there was a man it was kind of quite posh American, and everyone was in kind of suits and stuff except this one man who looked like a tramp. And anyway, I was talking to him afterwards, and I thought basically he was a tramp, but we had a great discussion. And afterwards I got a phone call saying, "Oh, so-and-so wants to see you." Now, so-and-so was a multi-millionaire. And I thought, okay, I'll go round to his house. And I went round to his house, and it was the tramp. And I realized, okay, you got to learn. Don't judge people by what they wear. Don't judge them by their skin color. Don't judge them by their outward appearance. So I think that's important. I think if you're in a church that historically has at times supported racism, there is a place for saying we got this wrong and we apologize. My own church, the Free Church of Scotland in the 19th century, for a while accepted money from people who were slave traders in the South. Now, it's a different time, different criteria and so on, but there was a very famous freed slave called Frederick Douglass who came round, and he preached in several of our churches, send back the money. And my own particular congregation became a center of the, again, of course I wasn't around in 1843, but did support Douglass in his claims, but maybe that's something that we could do. Yeah, sure. Can we give you the microphone so that they can pick it up? Yeah. So.
Can you hear that? I was just wondering, do you think there's any problem with people apologising for things that they didn't do?
Yeah, apologising for things they didn't do. Yes, I do think there's enormous. I hate people apologising for what they didn't do on behalf of others, because why does that make any sense? I mean, I was brought up in the Highlands of Scotland. I was minister in an area called Sutherland, which had been cleared. In other words, the peasants, had been cleared off the land by the Duke of Sutherland. And there's a big monument, and if any statue was to come down, I would want that one to come down, although now I think it should stay there as a testimony to its cruelty. And it did cross my mind that I would like the current Duchess of Sutherland, who's one of the richest people in Britain, to apologise for what her ancestor did. And there may be some scope in that. But overall, I don't think I should take credit for what my ancestors did, and I don't think I should take blame for what they did, but I should reflect upon the fact that they are part of who I am. And therefore there has to be an element of a degree of sorrow that, I did put on my Psalter. I'm very proud of the Scottish Psalter, but I also recognise that it's been misused. So I don't feel the need to defend every action that my ancestors took, and I don't feel the need to repent for every action that they took, but I do need to be aware of them, is how I would put it. Thank you. It's a good question.
There's a question here on redress. How far should racism be redressed? Change the names of music bands and products and so on. But I think you can probably answer the question more broader as well, because redress is probably a complicated thing.
Well, redress is extremely complicated. So what do you want to do? So let's, redress for things that happened 200 years ago. Well, what about 1,000 years ago? The Germans invaded Britain, or whatever, the Saxons. What about the Romans? They massacred, the Italians murdered lots of French people. How far back are we going to go, and how much of all of this is involved? And I think there are lots of trivial things. I think music bands renaming themselves. The Dixie Chicks are now just going to call themselves the Chicks. Well, I think, as a feminist, that's misogynistic. So I just think they should call themselves nothing. And it's just absurd. In fact, that has more in common with the Cultural Revolution of Mao than it has with a Western liberal, I would hope, proper progressive attitude. It's like people saying, we're going to do this to show how good we are, and I think that really is appalling. Changing the names of cereals. Basically, I reckon I could find offence in almost anything. Rose Bay, there's got to be something wrong with Rose, or Rose did something, or whatever. There's got to be, we have to stop this, we have to stop that. And if you go back far enough, I think you'll find that there were lots of divisions and massacres and so on amongst Indigenous people as well. This idea that there was some pure paradise that was spoilt by white people who came, no, that's not true. It wasn't pure either. That's the radical teaching of the Bible, is that every race has sin, and there are problems and difficulties in every situation. We don't accept that. I do think, the redress thing, I think ultimately God will sort everything out on the day of judgment. I think if you start doing it just now, it doesn't become redress, it becomes revenge, and it becomes the rich and powerful, again, taking largely from other people. So I'd be very wary of it.
Are there any questions? Raja.
David, thank you for that very interesting talk. From the nature of your talk, it appeared to me as though racism is defined by differences in the color of the skin.
Yeah.
Is there then a difference between racism and ethnicism?
Racism, and sorry, what was that?
And ethnicism.
Ethnicism, yeah. Yeah, because, so for example, I think that's actually a really, really important question, because, it's interesting. I was speaking to a Nigerian friend. Now in Scotland at the moment, I think we've got about 80 different Nigerian churches, and some of them are defined along tribal lines, on ethnicity. Or you had the situation in Rwanda and Burundi with the Hutus and the Tutsis. That wasn't about color of skin, but it was about ethnicity. And I do think that there are issues involved with that. My own view tends to be that racism, as we perceive it now as being primarily about skin color, is stronger, I think, now because of identitarian politics than it's been for many years. But the notion of ethnic divisions is very clear. And I would go further than that. I would talk about tribalism. Now, in Scotland, we think if you're from the next village, you're from a different country. Or we did. That's the essence of tribalism. And it's good to have a sense of identity and a sense of place. But tribalism can go wrong. So I'm not saying that Sydney people and Melbournians are different nations, but I do find it remarkably easy to upset somebody from Melbourne by mentioning how much better the coffee is in Sydney. And, that's a kind of jokey ethnic rivalry. But take, for example, I think it's a big mistake to talk about China and the Chinese people as just being one, because there are different ethnic groups within that. And in Europe, Europe was responsible for fighting 2 major world wars between different, if you like, ethnicities and different power groups. So I actually think that's an astute observation, that there is a difference between racism, which is on the basis of skin color, and ethnicity, which can be more different tribal or country bound. And I also think the earlier question about social class is significant as well. And sometimes all of these can get really mixed up as well. So that's helpful.
See, I come from Sri Lanka originally, and the ethnic wars that Sri Lanka suffered.
Yeah. So, yes, Tamils
was far worse than what we are seeing now.
Yeah. And sadly, I think as well, I should have mentioned something else, I think religion can come into that as well. I do think religion can be a cause of, or an aggravator for division amongst people. And I would be very, very wary of that. I think as a Christian, my responsibility is not to hate or to attack or to seek to convert other people by force, but just simply to live and to proclaim the love of Christ. And I think religion is very often a cause of the kind of thing that you're talking about. And I think in Sri Lanka that was you had the secular Tamil Tigers, didn't you? And then you had the Sinhalese Buddhist and so on. It was horrific. You're right. Yeah, sure.
Is it possible at all that the devil could use racism to divide us?
Oh, yeah. Could the devil use racism? Of course. The devil use anything to divide us. There's lots of things. I love the fact, I tell you one of the things I love about Sydney. I did not expect this. Right now, you'll laugh at this because I come from Scotland and we're not known for our haute cuisine, so haggis and things like that. And I come to Sydney and I just love the many different food styles that there are. I've had the best Thai I've ever had. best Chinese I've ever had, best Indian I've ever had, best Greek I've ever had. Maybe in Scotland it's not been that great, but for me it's just wonderful that we've got this variety. I think God made the world so that we would have variety, that we would be different people and so on. The idea that everyone in the world would be one color is as ludicrous to me as everyone being one height or one sex or whatever. And therefore, I think God made us as a human race. This idea of diversity and unity go together in that we're all made in the image of God, but we're diverse. I think what the devil seeks to do, to answer your question, is he seeks to destroy that. And I think he seeks to destroy it by getting us to destroy one another. And therefore, I think the most important thing for me always is to look at every human being as somebody made in the image of God. Whether you're lying in the gutter drunk, whatever skin color you are, whatever background, I have to have that. I do have that belief, but I have to act upon that belief. So yes.
I'm going to ask a question. It's probably an obvious question. We know that Christians, while they can never justify racism, we all have different views about how to approach this issue and things like redress and so on. So when you speak up here, do you represent the view of all Christians, or do you admire other people's views that have a different approach to you?
I'm so tempted. Well, I represent the views of all sane Christians. So sorry, no, honestly, sorry, that was Scottish humour. No, look, I don't. I think about these things myself. I think out loud. I think when I say what the Word of God says, that should be the view of all Christians. There are applications, like, for example, the question of redress, that I could be wrong on that. That's my wife often tells me that I'm wrong. I don't believe her, but apparently that may even be possible at some points. I could be wrong on that, and I have been wrong on many things, and I've been open to persuasion on many things. Yeah. Do you mind if I just shoot through some of these questions? Just because I think since people have put them in. Do you think that the church's general passivity towards racism in the modern era has led to the rise in popularity of BLM? No, I don't actually. I don't really think the church has been that passive. I think it's been largely weak and ineffective because I think the church in general has turned away from the gospel and has lost the basis. I think the rise of BLM is much more to do with identity politics and mass confusion in Western society, and probably a lot of it for me is imported from America as well, because there are particular issues involved in racism there. What do you think the church can do to tackle racism in society other than preach the gospel? Well, preach the gospel is about the number one thing you can do to tackle racism, because not only should you preach the gospel, but you should live the gospel. And if you live the gospel, you cannot be a racist, and you cannot tolerate racism, and you cannot put up with racism. There's a wonderful Clint Eastwood film called Gran Torino. Okay, when I say wonderful, I realize I'm online as well. There are certain warnings that come with it. The language is not great, and there's a lot of violence. But plot spoiler as well for you, Clint Eastwood plays this grumpy old ex-soldier in, I think it's maybe Detroit or Cleveland, a rundown area of town that has become, like many rundown areas of towns, it's been taken over, in his case, by Vietnamese, by Cambodians, and various other groups. And there's a kind of gang warfare between different people and everything else. Anyway, he's got Vietnamese neighbors or Cambodian neighbors, and he treats them really, really badly. And it's really interesting what the film says about racism, because his family, white, of course, they're bankers and lawyers out in the suburbs, and they come in and they hear him using racist language, and they're, "Oh, Dad, you can't say that, you can't say that." And yet Clint Eastwood, this is the spoiler alert, is the one who ends up giving his life for a Cambodian boy. And you start thinking, all the talk about racist language, I want to know what people are actually doing. And I would say the same with the church. live the gospel. That's what I would say. Is there such a thing as a superior culture? Yes, Scottish. If a culture believes in eating children, is that superior, inferior, or equal? Oh, trick question. No. All cultures are sinful. Can we start with that one? There's no culture that's perfect. Are there some cultures that are better than others on some issues? Absolutely. Of course there are. But it's very interesting. Every single human culture seems to have a basic set of ethics. Where does that come from? Paul in Romans 2 tells us that it comes from the law of God being written on people's hearts. Now, I think cultures inevitably change and destroy themselves. Okay, where's the one? I'm a Chinese migrant. My experience of Aussie church is that there's a separation between Australian-born Christians and migrant people. Is it language? Okay, that's a complex question. I'm also a migrant, but I'm not Chinese. Though in this world, I can be whatever I want to be, can't I, in the modern world? I can identify as Chinese, and I'd love to, because I love Chinese culture. But I would suggest this. I would say, and I've noticed this, I was with Koreans as well. If the church becomes a means of you retaining a particular culture, then there ends up being a problem. Now, most of the Chinese majority churches I've been in have not been like that. Sometimes language is an issue. So if it's a Mandarin church, speaking church, you find that second and third generation will often drift away. It's the reason why I think in St. Thomas's, where I go just now, on the North Shore, a number of the Chinese people who come are younger people, though there are one or two older ones as well. I'll tell you, I'll offer you a controversial opinion that came from a Chinese gentleman who said to me that he and his wife, their experience was that Australian churches were very friendly, but it was hard to make friends. And I thought that's quite a profound remark. And maybe that's true of other cultures as well. And maybe something we need to reflect on. But my own belief, by the way, and I've no reason other than observation for saying this, is I think that just as in the United Kingdom, the one area in the United Kingdom where the church is growing is London, and that's because of migrants, largely African, but often also Asian. I actually think the salvation of the church in Australia will be from migrants and largely East Asian, in my view, at least in terms of numbers. Religion is the greatest evil humanity has inflicted upon itself, and Christianity is the worst of all of them. What is your response? To Jody, I would suggest you contact me personally, because I'm really trying hard to be restrained in my response at this moment. I would suggest that you need to find out something about religion and history, because your comment would indicate that your awareness of these things is somewhat limited. I do not think that Christianity is worse than, for example, the Baal worship where children were slaughtered. I find it difficult to see Christianity as being worse than Islam. I really do. And I think that there are all kinds of problems in that comment. I also don't think that religion is the greatest evil humanity has inflicted upon itself. That seems to me a highly prejudicial attitude. I suspect the invention of guns might be a greater evil. I think sexual abuse is a greater evil. You could even argue that money is a greater evil if you want to go that particular route. Christianity is not the solution unless it employs liberation theology. What are your thoughts? Absolutely not, because liberation theology is not Christianity. If you use liberation theology as the idea of theology, in other words, knowing God should set us free, amen, true. But liberation theology is in effect a kind of pseudo-Marxism which is disguised as Christianity, and that doesn't help anyone. It really doesn't. Thoughts on some of the methods? We've already mentioned those: riots, cancel culture. No. We fight racism with love. Is Christianity homophobic? Nothing to do with the subject. Come back again for another one with that. Anything else, or are we just about done? I think.
I think if people are still on, they can keep their questions going, and David, he writes a blog, So he can always get to bigger issues.
People can always contact me as
Yes.
well, the wee fleas.
Yes, exactly. So thank you so much for joining us here and online. I don't think there's any closing words that we need to say.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. When I'm saying about apologies, I do honestly want to say this. If anyone has experienced racism within the Christian church, I'm a pastor in the Christian church. In one sense, I'm not going to speak for other people, but in this I am. I'm deeply ashamed that anything that goes by the name of Christian should ever behave in a racist manner. And I do ask that you accept our apologies. Also, by the way, if I've said anything on here that's offensive to you in any way, then get over it. No, I do apologize. I don't mean to offend people. And I really, really do want to say this, that I've experienced myself the unity and the joy that being in Christ brings. And I will tell you this, that I have much more in common with a fellow Christian of whatever skin color than I do of people from my own country, in some ways even from my own family. And I think that level of unity where we're all one in Christ is deeply moving and deeply important. But I meant what I said about the apology at the beginning. If you've experienced racism in the church of any kind, whatever your skin color, then we are deeply ashamed of that. And we hope that you will exercise the same forgiveness that Christ has given to us.
Thanks, David. Those are good words to end on. For those of you who are joining us online, remember to post your questions, keep in touch with us. You can get us on our website. Thank you, and thanks for joining us.